So a little over a week ago, I finished listening to and judging the California All-State band auditions for Bassoon. And even if you are not planning to audition for California All-State band as a bassoonist, there's so much that I learn and observe listening to these auditions, and I wanted to share some of the thoughts I had with you. And hopefully this will be useful to you if you're preparing not just for this audition, but any audition, and also just a lot of general advice as well. It's really helpful to get to hear a bunch of students that are all sort of at a similar age across an entire state. What are they up to? What are they doing? What are they sounding like? First of all, I just wanted to say that the California Band Directors Association, which runs the all-state auditions here in California, has a policy of not allowing me to share any of the recordings with anyone. And I think it's a shame. I actually think that it would be wonderful if CBDA would allow or even allow people to opt in to having their recordings shared, because I think it would really be beneficial if everyone could actually listen to these auditions. Instead, you can listen to me talk about what I heard and what I thought about this year's auditions. My first thought is that I do not believe scales should be on auditions. I realize that I am in the minority in holding this opinion, but I hold it anyways. And I respectfully and vehemently disagree. Scales should never be on an audition. There's a lot of arguments to be made why scales should be on an audition, and certainly you can tell a lot about someone's playing by listening to them play scales. I just firmly believe that scales should never ever be practiced with a sense of fear or pressure or tension. Listening to the auditions this year, man, nobody played their scales really all that well, and it only convinces me more. I think one of the reasons why scales are put on auditions and often on playing tests in like a band class is to sort of scare people into practicing, because everyone knows scales are really good for you, right? They're like the vegetables of our practice regimen. And I do actually think that's pretty true, but it doesn't work. It was clear to me that the vast majority of people auditioning under-practiced their scales. They were not very well prepared. You could tell that people were worried about their solo so much more, and therefore their scales suffered. You could sense that people were worried about getting the scale up to tempo, and therefore it made the scale even worse. The tempo given is quarter note equals 96. Most people were playing at about 125, even though there were mistakes and imperfections all over the place. Of the handful of auditioners that played their scales significantly under that tempo of quarter note equals 96, I was pretty disappointed that they still weren't playing slow enough to actually play the scale cleanly and evenly. I'm really much more bothered by all the people that play their scales fast, because as a teacher, as an audition judge, and also from the perspective of the person practicing, when the scale is played fast, there's so much that becomes really difficult to hear. So I would find myself having to listen to the same recording of a scale over and over again, trying to be like, wait a second, did they crack a note? Did they skip a note? What's going on here in the scale? And playing faster just makes it harder to hear. And I am just completely unimpressed by how fast someone can play a scale. I remember being a student, I know that for a time, playing a B major scale can feel a lot less comfortable than playing an F major scale, for instance. But if you're playing and practicing the scale well, that discrepancy should become very, very small. And, I could hear some people play different scales with wildly different qualities and wildly different tempi. And that told me that, okay, these kids aren't practicing their scales adequately, even though it's on the audition. So, for what it's worth, I think scales on auditions is dumb. I'm looking forward to making a video in the coming months about how I approach scales, because I can talk about scales. I can for hours, and I can play scales for hours and enjoy myself. Another thing that I heard listening to California All-State Band auditions was lots of what I would call unintentional staccato. And this is something that I heard both on the scales and the solo. What I mean by unintentional staccato is sometimes you'll hear someone play something extremely short in a way that really is clearly not a stylistic decision, but rather just a habit. So let's say someone's playing an A flat major scale and they play super staccato. Like, literally, I heard some that would be like, and I'm sorry, they weren't that good either. But they were literally that short. Like, it's very hard to hear if the notes are speaking cleanly, if there's good intonation, if their dynamic is actually even, or at least if it if it's going to fluctuate, if it fluctuates in a musical way. This is a habit or a side effect that a lot of people experience when they're playing fast, is they just play really, really staccato. And I think that's something that is just, worth looking out for. I think especially for young bassoonists, the unintentional staccato can often be a side effect of not having a very good reed. And it's hard to have good reeds when you're in high school. That becomes an affordability issue. That's an issue with the quality of one's teacher. It's really out of the student's control a lot of times. And so I do try to be a bit forgiving of this, but at the same time, it makes my job as an audition judge a lot more difficult, because unintentional staccato is not only an off-putting sound, but it obscures the sound. In other words, it makes it harder for me to hear how cleanly notes are speaking. It's hard to hear, intonation and just sort of general technique stuff. And so if you make my job harder, I'm liable to score you lower. It's just human nature. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not trying to be vengeful. But if it's harder for me to hear what's going on, I'm not going to just assume that you're a great player. And I just want to point out, while again, there are a lot of ways in which the quality of a student's read is sometimes out of their control, either because they don't have the money, or again because their teacher isn't working with them on reads enough. And the truth is, I think most bassoon teachers don't work on reads enough with their students. But I do want to just emphasize what a huge difference that your reads make. Playing with a good read versus playing with a mediocre read can make you sound like you've have a few years more experience. I know for me, a lot of time when I was younger, I often would put off working on my reads thinking, I need to practice. Practice is more important than my read time. But the truth is, if you're able to spend some time and make your reads work better for you, it is worth sacrificing practice time if you have to, because the read affects our intonation, our articulation, our dynamic. It affects how, if you're playing on anything other than a good read, it's going to hold you back. It's going to make you sound like a worse player than you are. Not only are you going to give a less good impression on an audition, you're probably going to give yourself a less good assessment of yourself, and that's going to lower your confidence, and confidence is also such a huge part. Another thing that playing with bad reads does is it creates bad habits. It makes us play with more tension than we need to, more force. It makes us use too much embouchure. And so it creates bad habits that can kind of last for years, even as your reads get better. So this is why I think even for beginning students, finding a teacher, making sure that you yourself, appreciate and understand how important that read is just so important on a bassoon. Low quality reads hurt people on their auditions a lot. Very few people were playing on good reads on their auditions. If you're looking for good reads, check out lilasskickers.com. But also, talk to if you have a private teacher, do talk to them. Insist that they spend time with you adjusting your reads, because even a high quality read is likely going to need some adjustment over time. And you can even contact me. I'm happy to do, one-off or occasional read working sessions virtually. Although obviously if you have someone you can do this with in person, that is usually going to be a better option. Another thing that I noticed listening to the auditions this year was nearly everyone played with wildly inconsistent tempi. I'm not talking about rushing and dragging. Rushing and dragging is certainly a bad habit, but it's also one that takes a long time and experience, I think, to get rid of, or even just to minimize. I mean playing one section at one tempo, and then there's like a measure of rest, or not even between rests. Suddenly you're in a new section or new phrase, and it's a wildly different tempo. A lot of times they would actually play faster when they got to the fast sections. It was all over the board. I really was hearing this in all but maybe 2 or 3 of the auditions. Maybe even just 1 or 2, honestly. Like there were so many that were doing this. Considering that these were recorded auditions, I was kind of shocked and sad to hear how nearly universal this was. I think it might to some degree speak to the fact that the audition deadline this year was moved up to mid-October. So I think a lot of students probably weren't working on their auditions over the summer and really had to kind of did a rush job of preparing. Maybe that was part of it. Maybe it's AI brain rot. I don't know. But if you want to stand out, keep the same tempo for the entire movement unless there's a new tempo marking. Just checking my notes here. Yes, indeed. It really got me thinking about this, what causes such inconsistent tempi within like the same movement, within really one excerpt of a movement of a concerto. And I think it really has to do with not doing the right amount of run-throughs. And what I mean by right amount is, I'm a big advocate of practicing in small sections. In part because when you practice in small sections, you can play different sections at different tempo that are going to work for you, or meet your needs of practice for that section. Of course, the drawback to this is that it could theoretically encourage you to play these sections at different tempi. So it is also important to have run-throughs so you do practice having a consistent tempo throughout. On the other hand, I think a lot of students much more often will play too many run-throughs. In fact, too much of their practice will consist of run-throughs. And when you run through things over and over and over again, day after day, the mind becomes very good at bending space and time. So that when the brain gets to a section that it knows really, really well, or that is sort of committed to muscle memory, the brain has a tendency to go, yeah, and just speed through the section. But we don't perceive it ourselves as doing that. This is, it's what I will sometimes refer to as the good reader brain. Meaning, when people read books, we tend to read faster than people talk, but we don't, in our minds, is not like, oh, it was weird, everyone talks so fast in the book. No, our brain takes the information, even though we're reading faster than people talk, and we absorb it and experience that as a sort of normal pace. And so we do the same thing when we're playing music. It's a very difficult habit to fight. But if you practice something over and 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 over again, especially when you don't even need to practice it, or you don't really have a great sense of purpose as you're practicing it, the brain gets tired. The brain just like, come on, let's just get through this. And even sometimes with sections that will seem more difficult, the brain will get really excited, like for different reasons. It's not just out of boredom that the brain goes faster. But I guess in a sense, what I'm saying is our imagination takes over and fixes the timing for us. And that becomes harder to catch if you allow your brain to sort of become less active and less involved, or if you allow your brain to get a little bit numb from over practicing, I guess. So I just would like to offer some advice about tempo. And that is that you should really make sure that you're getting something out of it. If I listen to an audition and someone is playing really fast and they make a bunch, or honestly even just a few mistakes, they're going to be penalized for it perhaps more heavily than someone who plays at a more moderate tempo, because it's just too annoying for me to hear someone play and be left to wonder, like, well, could they handle this at a lower tempo? Like, why are they doing this? Why are they playing this at this tempo? A fast tempo also sounds like you're not aware of the mistakes you're making. Because if you're playing ostensibly faster than you need to and you're making mistakes, it suggests that you don't really realize you're making those mistakes. If someone plays slow and steady, even if they're under the tempo they were supposed to be at, it gives me confidence that they know what they're doing, that they're responsible, and I'm going to have confidence in their abilities. I might have a little bit less confidence in their confidence because sometimes I will hear someone play slowly and wonder, well, why are they going so slow? They're playing great. They're probably ready to play faster at that point. If someone plays slow and still is making mistakes, then I'm going to think that they're either sort of just doing their best or being realistic, or that they're nervous. In other words, I'm going to be sort of more empathetic to that person than someone who's making a bunch of mistakes and playing fast. So, theoretically, if I heard someone play a section and there were like 5 missed notes and one person played a good bit over tempo and one person played a good bit under tempo, I'm likely to think more highly of the person playing under tempo. Another thing I thought about when I was listening to auditions was that recording studios and engineers still exist for a reason. Reverb is not your friend. Most recordings submitted were clearly just sort of made on a cell phone, and they're of high enough quality that I can sort of hear what's going on. But there was a significant amount of recordings where people added reverb on top. I'm not talking about those that recorded in a echoey gym, but people that they're adding artificial reverb to their recordings. And I get it. It might sound nice to you. It certainly can sound nice to play in a stairwell or a bathroom or whatever, but it makes it harder to hear what's going on. It really just sort of creates a lot of noise that I have to sort of cut through. While I might have to try harder to hear, I'm still going to hear imperfections. So Reverb isn't actually going to help you hide anything, and it's going to just sort of annoy the person listening to your recording. Even though it might sound nicer, it might sound more like what you perceive a professional recording to sound like, although everyone that seems to add reverb adds way more reverb than you will hear on professional recordings, or a much less subtle reverb. There's really so many aspects to reverb. As someone who's had, some limited experience doing sound editing and in recording studios, you're just adding reverb in like GarageBand or whatever. It's not going to be a good reverb. It's not helping you. CBDA does allow some editing of these recordings. And I suspect the reason why they do that is because they think it'd be too hard to catch people. And so they say, don't do an edit in the middle of the phrase. By the way, an edit in the middle of the phrase is much easier to hear. But if you're going to edit in the middle of a rest, if you have decent software and you know what you're doing, or you're lucky, you can do some edits that will be sort of imperceptible. I, however, did hear a few people who edited in the middle of a note. I noticed this particularly on a few scales where the last note of the scale, one of the things that I think people often will say is make sure you hold that last note of your scale. It's certainly a bad habit to end a scale and sort of play the last note short. And so I think I heard one or two people that clearly had edited the last note. And the way that I could tell is that there would be a sudden change in the volume and maybe even the intonation. I was listening to the second round of auditions, so presumably those that were supposed to be disqualified had already been disqualified. But I caught a few more that I was pretty certain had edited their recordings in a way that should have disqualified them. I didn't disqualify them, I just scored them really low on that particular scale or the solo or whatever. It is slightly possible that what I was actually hearing was like a noise canceling, like a speech, and sometimes you'll see something speech enhance or noise canceling, and it will perceive music as background noise, and so it'll suddenly sort of bring the volume down. Do not expect that you can fool someone with your sound editing. Really, there's no reason to be editing your recordings. And in fact, I would say if you're auditioning for college or a summer festival or whatever, and you're submitting a recording, if you do feel like something sounds edited but wasn't, I would suggest have a few other people listen to it. If for some reason there is like a weird noise cancellation that was added on or something that makes it sound edited, I would re-record that, because even in a situation where it's not about disqualifying someone, if someone suspects that you're making edits to your recording, it's going to affect their entire impression of your playing. Another thing that comes up, which comes up nearly every year I do this, is just thinking about how difficult it is to score and judge these auditions. I'm lucky as a bassoonist that there's generally a lot fewer auditions to listen to than, say, the clarinets or the flutes. Assigning an objective number to something that is ultimately subjective, I think, should be awkward to just about any musician or artist. There are very few things about music that are objective. I can say whether you played the right note or not, but that's not really at the heart of what I think of your playing, of your effectiveness as a musician. While the sort of rubrics that they give us and over 10 years of experience certainly have made this easier, I think it's important for anyone that's auditioning to understand that the results of an audition are ultimately involve a lot of luck and some arbitrary decision making, and they should never just be taken too seriously. For instance, if I hear a bunch of really disappointing auditions in a row and then I hear someone play, pretty decent, I'm likely going to score them a lot higher than if I just heard a few of the best players and then hear someone that's just kind of like, pretty good. Another example would be if you put together really the absolute best audition and I listen to yours first, I'm going to score you a bit more conservatively to leave room for people that might do better. By the way, because of this, what I always do is I will listen to each element of the audition in a different order so that no one gets heard first for each scale and each movement of the solo. I always switch it around. Who's getting heard first? I'll switch the order that I'm listening to things in to help me deal with this. But ultimately, you're contextualized by the other people that you're auditioning with. a bit more nitty gritty about these particular auditions. Every scale and every category is scored on a scale of 1 to 50. And what I do as a judge is I'll typically think of it actually as a score of 1 to 5. So I'll have in my mind a pretty clear idea of, well, what constitutes being a 1, a 2, 3, 4, or 5. And that's simple enough to do. But then I have to decide the second digit of the number, right? I have to decide, well, what's the difference between a 32 and a 36? And ultimately, that really comes down to a sort of gut decision making. As much as I, try to be objective, again, we're doing something subjective, and depending on what else I've heard is going to affect those sort of perceptions. I remember when I was younger and I would prepare auditions, I think I had this idea in my head that the person listening to me was essentially going to be tallying up my mistakes, and that's not how I do it. That's not how I understand most people to do this. When I listen to someone play, I'm not counting mistakes. I'm not counting the times you're out of tune. That would just be ridiculous. When I listen to music, I want to enjoy it. And that's the truth when I listen to auditions as well, even though, I might be trying to think constructively or with a certain amount of judgment, I guess. I'm listening for the good in someone's playing. The best auditions are ones where I hear people and have a sense of their own enjoyment of their playing. I think it's important to understand as a musician that mistakes don't have to ruin a performance, and they don't have to ruin an audition, as much as we obviously practice and try to avoid them. Playing music, whether it's a performance or practice or an audition, really should be about creating the sounds that we want to hear more than it's about avoiding the ones we don't. A few final thoughts I'd like to share about, just being on the other end of the audition process. There's so much to learn and improve upon from going through this process, both as a player, but also as a judge. And if you ever are in the position where you're able to listen to auditions, whether you're actually going to be the person judging or just sort of auditing the experience, I highly recommend it, because you start to hear trends, you start to hear what are the common mistakes, what are the common things that people do or don't do, what typically works, what doesn't work. I hope that you have been told this. I hope you will be told this many more times, that even if you are unhappy with the way you play or with the results of an audition, that the process of doing it is one with a lot of potential for growth, where you really can learn so much and improve upon so much by doing it. One of the things that struck me in this year's All-State auditions was that I didn't feel like I really heard a very wide range of talent, even though I heard a wide range of performances. So what does that mean? It means I heard a very wide range of preparation, and that the best auditions I heard sounded like they came not from more talented players, but just from people that took more time to prepare their auditions. And it's true that someone who is more talented might need less time to prepare an audition, but what I'm trying to say is even the best auditions that I heard this year were of a quality to me that sounded within reach of just about anyone who's been practicing regularly for a few years on their instrument. Meaning that if they were to spend enough time practicing something, practicing diligently, practicing thoughtfully, that they could produce a recording that would be good enough to get one of the top slots in California All-State. This is something I think about a lot. My own perceptions of my level of talent when I was in high school and when I was in college. And just how kind of irrelevant that is. Talent is certainly a thing. We all have talents. There are many different talents that are involved in creating music. But when you're in high school, when you're in college, your brain is still developing. So your brain develops really, into your 20s. Your practice habits develop even longer than that. Your mind develops, my mind is still, I hope, developing. Your full level of talent doesn't even really exist yet. What really exists at this point is your level of preparation. I know life is busy and that most people auditioning for All-State don't actually center their universe around bassoon. So it's understandable to me that adequate preparation is probably not going to be the norm of the auditions that I hear. But don't kid yourself or let anyone convince you that you're not good enough to get into All-State, because it's absolutely, I think, attainable to nearly anyone if they are able to give themselves enough time to prepare. A lot of times we kid ourselves in thinking we're not talented enough for something, or that we simply are talented enough. And then we start to think that our level of preparation is not as important as our level of talent. But that's just completely untrue. Your level of preparation is by far going to be the biggest factor in most audition situations at like a high school and college level. It may not seem like that. Some people are just much more efficient and effective with their time, but that is a different thing than sort of innate ability. Anyways, those are most of the thoughts that I felt like were worthy of being shared. Thank you for watching. Do all that liking, subscribing, sharing stuff. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions about the audition process, please leave them in the comments. I'll do my best to answer. And happy practicing. Blah, 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 blah. Blah, 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 blah. Blah, 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 blah.